Okay, this is the module that accompanies the learning chapter, and it just gives you some more specific information on classical and operant conditioning. And we talked about a little bit of the information on this in the chapter presentation, but I'll cover it again here. Some goals of the current module. You should be familiar with terms associated with classical and operant conditioning, including within the classical conditioning domain, extinction and spontaneous recovery, stimulus generalization and stimulus discrimination, which we've discussed previously. Within operant conditioning, you should know the difference between continuous and partial schedules. Specifically, you should be able to give examples of variable ratio, fixed ratio, variable interval, and fixed interval schedules. So, some major classical conditioning processes. Extinction is a gradual disappearance of the conditioned response after repeatedly exposing the participant to the conditioned stimulus without the pairing of the unconditioned response. For instance, if you remember the little Albert experiment, the experiment with the child where the child was trained to be afraid of a white rat, if we kept showing Albert the white rat without ever again pairing the rat with a loud noise, over time his fear would extinguish. It might take a while, but if you just keep repeating showing the white rat without ever scaring the child again when he saw a rat, the fear should go away or extinguish. Spontaneous recovery is a reappearance of the conditioned response after you think you've extinguished it. So, for instance, if you were working with little Albert and you had for 2 weeks shown him the white rat and it seemed like finally he wasn't afraid of it, then you go to the lab the next day, show him the rat, and he starts to cry, then you know that you have spontaneous recovery of the conditioned response of fear. And so to help him get over the fear, then you just continue the extinction process. Stimulus generalization and discrimination was discussed briefly in our Chapter 7 overview, but just to cover it again, generalization is when you observe the conditioned response to a stimulus similar but not identical to a conditioned stimulus. So again, referring to the little Albert experiment with the fear of the white rat, Albert's fear generalized to white rabbits, to a white furry Santa Claus mask, and to other stimuli that were similar to but not identical to the white rat. Discrimination or stimulus discrimination is when the participant is able to differentiate or distinguish between the original conditioned stimulus and irrelevant stimuli. So, for instance, if you showed little Albert a big black dog, he would probably not be afraid of it because it's too different from the original stimulus of the white rat. And you'll notice, for instance, while little Albert's afraid of the rat in the video link I'll give you, he's not afraid of the humans in this scenario. You will see that he's afraid of a white furry Santa Claus mask that's similar but not identical to the original stimulus. So being afraid of a rat but not human shows discrimination. Fear to the white furry Santa Claus mask shows generalization. And that link, if you go to YouTube, just type in Baby Albert Experiments, and it'll take you to a short clip of little Albert. Now let's turn to reinforcement schedules, and these are relevant to operant conditioning. And what reinforcement schedules refer to is how often you're going to reinforce the participant, whether it's a human or an animal. If it's a continuous schedule, then every time the desired behavior occurs or the desired response is made, the participant gets a reinforcement. So if you're teaching your dog to sit and he's gradually learning it, it's a really good idea at the beginning of that process to give him a small treat every single time he sits. Partial schedules, there are 4 types, and the name partial implies, of course, that you're not going to reinforce every single occurrence of the behavior. The reason for this is that believe it or not, you can actually sustain behavior longer with partial schedules than you can with continuous schedules. We tend to kind of get either satiated or satisfied with rewards. That's one reason why these partial schedules are better. The other is there's something kind of intriguing to humans and animals about partial schedules. We tend to be over optimistic in terms of when the reward is going to occur, and so we persist longer. Okay, to understand these schedules, these four types, it's helpful to remember that ratio, the word ratio, will always refer to the number of responses that the participant makes. In other words, the number of times they have to show the behavior before you reward them. So 2 of the partial schedules are ratio schedules. Fixed ratio schedules occur after a specified number of responses. For an example, you might be getting a 10% bonus after you sell 10 cars. After the 10 behaviors of successful sales occur, you always get a 10% bonus. So it's predictable. Variable ratio still refers to number of responses, but it's after an unpredictable number of responses from the participant's perspective. From the administrator of the reinforcer's perspective, they know on average when they're going to reward the participant. For instance, it may be on average you reward every 5th response, but let's say you reward after the first response, then after the 10th, then after the 20th, after the 4th. And so the person getting the reward never knows when it's going to come. And this is basically very, very similar to a lot of gambling where the person doesn't know when the reward's going to occur. So an example would be winning at a slot machine after some unpredictable number of responses. Interval always refers to time, so the remaining 2 schedules that are partial are interval schedules. Fixed interval reinforcement occurs after a specified time. So an example is getting paid every 2 weeks. Variable interval happens after an unpredictable time. So maybe getting a kiss from your partner this evening, 2 days, 30 days, 30 minutes, that's